February 1943, Tunisia. Dr. Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the Africa Corps, felt his stomach churn. An American soldier with a trivial scratch was receiving penicillin, a miracle drug that for his men dying of infections was a myth. This brutal paradox revealed the first lesson. War was not just the steel storm of artillery, but the overwhelming production superiority of the industrial colossus, a mathematics that tore apart German doctrine with incomprehensible blindness. The memory of Richter's fever, delirium, and slow death, for lack of a resource the enemy had in superabundance, burned in Bauer's mind. His mind, trained in the surgical precision and scarcity of the Reich, processed the brutal equation. Richter's septicemia, an inevitable condemnation in the Wehrmacht, was a solvable triviality for the American industrial colossus. This paradox was not isolated. It was the manifestation of production superiority that allowed for the steel storm of artillery. With ammunity, the mathematical defeat materialized in every drop of penicillin. In captivity, February 1943, Bauer quantified the terror of the paradox. Germany, with its blitzkrieg, had neglected its pharmaceutical infrastructure, producing penicillin in quantities that barely supplied the Reich's elite, a tiny fraction of demand. The American industrial colossus in 1942 was already producing millions of doses, escalating to billions by 1944. This superiority was no accident. The same overwhelming logic allowed for the steel storm of artillery, with massive ammunition production redefining defensive tactics. German blindness to the scale of this industrial logistics, which transformed a compound into a silent weapon of annihilation, was the true mathematical defeat. The ideological blindness of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht was pathological. In Berlin, strategists disdained American mass production as quantity without quality, focusing on the supposed inferiority of Allied equipment. They laughed at the absence of American total war, never conceiving that superiority lay in the overwhelming logistical scale that sustained not only the steel storm of artillery, with ammunition production redefining defensive tactics, but also the vitality and survival of every soldier. This incomprehensible abundance, manifested in penicillin factories and uninterrupted supply lines, sealed the fate of the Reich, a mathematical defeat they never fully grasped. Bauer's mind, accustomed to the lethal blitzkrieg, confronted the brutality of a war where volume, not technological vanguard, was decisive. The same blindness that disregarded the massive production of vital drugs, like penicillin, ignored the immense scale of American ammunition. While the Wehrmacht rationed every projectile, the Allied steel storm unleashed millions of tons, redefining tactics and tormenting morale. The logistical superiority of the Colosso Industrial was an equation of annihilation, incomprehensible. The memory of an American soldier, with a scratch treated with penicillin, shakes him. This paradox, not a tactical failure, but productive superiority, transformed life and death on an industrial scale, incomprehensible to the Wehrmacht. Pus and despair in German hospitals, with flawed logistics, contrasted with American prodigality. The Reich's blindness to mass production was a self-inflicted wound, while the Wehrmacht prided itself on the Tempestade de Osso. The true storm was of resources from the American Colosso Industrial, ammunition and penicillin, a silent agent of war. The mathematical defeat was not limited to tanks. It manifested in the inability to save Schmidt, while an American scratch was a mere inconvenience. The overwhelming industrial superiority was total, dismantling German ideology. The irony tormented Dr. Bauer. Germany, the cradle of modern pharmacology, a pioneer in the synthesis of arsenicals and sulfa drugs, had failed precisely where its scientific excellence. The Reich's military doctrine, obsessed with the blitzkrieg and the pursuit of high-impact Wunderwaffen like V-2 rockets and jet fighters, diverted resources and brilliant minds from preventive medicine and the mass production of essential pharmaceuticals. In Berlin, 1942, the synthesis and purification of penicillin, a notoriously complex and resource-intensive process, was underestimated and relegated to an almost artisanal production, focused on small quantities for experimentation or elite use. Meanwhile, the American industrial colossus invested massively in gigantic bioreactors and industrial-scale fermentation techniques, transforming what was a laboratory curiosity into a logistical weapon of gigantic proportions. This was the true initial blindness, the inability to transpose scientific genius to the scale and speed of mass production. A failure as strategic as the underestimation of the American artillery's Tempestade de Asso. The mathematical defeat was not only on the bow. Klaus Richter, 16th Division, detailed mortality from infection that in some units exceeded direct combat casualties. Documents highlighted critical absence of antibacterials and urgency for sulfa drugs, penicillin unavailable, revealing institutional desperation. In February 43, Kesselring acknowledged the deterioration of troop recovery due to medical scarcity, without understanding the real gap with the enemy. For Dr. Bauer, cold statistics proved the brutal mathematical defeat behind the scenes of the Tempestade de Asso. The overwhelming American superiority in ammunition mirrored that in pharmaceuticals. The American industrial colossus not only forged tanks and projectiles, but produced health and survival on a colossal scale, exposing Germany's failure to view war as a total production equation. Dr. Bauer observed the flow of penicillin, recalling the brutally hierarchical and inhumane German rationing. In his Reich, a Lanzer's life was worth less than a gram of the Miracle D. German production, meager, never exceeded hundreds of thousands of annual doses, laughable compared to the billions of the American industrial colossus. In 1943, on the Eastern Front, septicemia claimed decorated soldiers. Penicillin, by decree, was for high-ranking officers, Luftwaffe pilots, and U-boats crews. The Lanzer was relegated to chance. His infection, a death sentence more frequent than enemy projectiles. This draconian and ethically questionable rationing was not just a productive failure. It proved that the Reich valued the war machine above individual well-being, sealing defeat not only in the storm of steel, but in the inability to save its men. In the OKW offices, the obsession with the storm of steel and tactical supremacy obscured the understanding of biological and logistical warfare. For Keitel and Jodl, the soldier's health was a secondary metric, an operational cost, not a strategic weapon. Their diaries, focused on Panzer and Messerschmitt, did not even meant. They saw mass production as qualitative inferiority, blind to the colossal scale of the industrial colossus. The mathematical defeat of the Reich would not only occur on the battlefield, but in the field hospitals. There, American logistical superiority sealed the fate of its men, transforming trivial infections into death sentences. The Allied storm of steel redefined German defensive tactics, exposing the failure to see war as a production equation. Dr. Bauer, captive in February 1943, tried to understand the German failure with penicillin. Despite Germany's chemical tradition, IG Farben, penicillin, a mold discovered by Fleming in 1928 and validated by Florey and Chain, remained a curiosity for the Reich. For the United States, however, this mold culture was a logistical and industrial revolution, the seed of a superiority that would punish the Wehrmacht not with projectiles, but with the ability to heal its men. The storm of steel of the American industrial colossus was in. In 1941, the American government, Comité de Pesquisa Médica and OSRD, orchestrated unprecedented collaboration among universities, pharmaceutical laboratories, and the private sector. Companies like Pfizer, Merck, and Squibb were mobilized, receiving funding and sharing patents and processes. An unthinkable strategy in the fragmented and bureaucratic German war economy, where internal competition stifled innovation at scale. The transition of penicillin production from milk bottles to deep tank fermentation bioreactors was a quantum leap. In Peoria, Illinois, scientists from the U.S. Department of Agriculture developed more efficient Penicillium strains and cultivation methods that exponentially multiplied the yield. Production from grams in 1941 jumped to hundreds of kilograms monthly by 1943, and to over 6.8 trillion units annually by 1945. The practical consequence of this production superiority was brutally evident in the field hospitals. While German surgeons, like Bauer, faced ethical dilemmas over who to deny vital treatment, American doctors could administer penicillin prophylactically, preventing infections before they even manifested. The mortality rate from infection in battle wounds, which was calamitous in World War I, was drastically reduced. For Dr. Bauer, the sight of an American soldier with a superficial wound receiving generous doses of the drug was the materialization of mathematical defeat. It wasn't just superiority in tanks or planes. It was the ability to keep its men alive and on the front. An army that regenerated with an efficiency that defied the logic of attrition warfare that the Wehrmacht understood. The American mold culture had transformed into a culture of life, a stark contrast to the culture of death imposed by German scarcity. The same industrial mindset that allowed for the produce. The logistics of penicillin distribution, integrated into the military supply chain, ensured that the medication reached the front lines with the same efficiency as ammunition and fuel. Germany, obsessed with an illusory qualitative superiority and a doctrine that underestimated total industrial warfare, was overcome by an enemy that transformed science into production, and production into an overwhelming superiority that sealed its fate. Penicillin was not just a medicine. It was a symbol of the scale of the Colosso Industrial, a silent agent of the Reich's defeat. For Dr. Friedrich Bauer, Allied penicillin, used even for trivial wounds, was a shock and an affront to his doctrine of war. In the Africa Corps, the scarce sulfanilamide was precisely rationed, a life-or-death decision imposed by scarcity. For the Allies, medicine was an extension of the American Colosso Industrial's production line, a calculated strategy for manpower preservation that the Wehrmacht would never conceive. In 1943, in Tunisia, Bauer observed penicillin being used not only to save critical lives, but prophylactically in almost all wounded, from shrapnel to fractures. This approach differed radically from the German one, which prioritized rapid fitness for combat and discarded gravely wounded as inevitable losses due to resource scarcity. A harrowing paradox for Bauer. The Wehrmacht Blitzkrieg conceived of war as rapid and decisive movements, where qualitative superiority and speed would minimize casualty logistics, hoping for quick victories to avoid a vast contingent of wounded. The American Colosso Industrial, however, operated under the opposite premise. War would be a test of endurance and production, where preserving and replacing manpower would be decisive. The numbers confirmed. Mortality from wound infections, which was 18% in World War I, fell to less than 4. 5% among the Allies in World War II, thanks to penicillin and other innovations. This was not mere medical improvement. B. The Allied doctrine of manpower preservation meant that a wounded soldier, who in the Wehrmacht would be a permanent casualty or face long convalescence with fatal infection, in the American Army had a superior chance of returning to combat in weeks or months. Intelligence reports revealed the priority: to keep the maximum number of men in the theater of operations, reducing the demand for replacements and the burden on personnel supply lines. Medical evacuation logistics, with equipped field hospitals and robust pharmaceutical supplies, was as vital as the flow of ammunition for the steel storm. The irony was profound. The mentality that allowed the USA to produce tens of thousands of Sherman tanks, inferior to Tiger, and millions of shells to saturate the battlefield, was applied to human life. Superiority did not reside merely in inflicting damage, but in absorbing and mitigating it. The American soldier was a component of a larger system, his recovery as important as the main 10. German blindness, focused on intrinsic quality and tactical self-sufficiency, never grasped the scale of the American industrial colossus's interconnectedness and redundancy. In 1944, in Normandia, the effectiveness of this doctrine was undeniable. German units suffered exhaustion and depletion of personnel due to inadequately treated wounds and diseases. Allied divisions, despite casualties, showed a capacity for recovery and re-engagement that defied expectations. Rommel's diary, without citing penicillin, lamented the enemy's incomprehensible ability to replace its losses and the incessant pressure of their formations, which, in retrospect, included the rapid recovery of combatants. The mathematics of abundance of penicillin meant a dramatically higher return of wounded soldiers to active duty for the Allies. This reduced the need for new recruits and maintained the cohesion and experience of veteran units. The Allied medical doctrine was therefore a strategic weapon of force. The Wehrmacht, stuck in a vision of war with scarce resources and individual tactics, was overcome by a nation that transformed medicine into an extension of the assembly line. The reports flowing from that white hell to the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, in Berlin, spoke not only of cold and hunger, but of an incomprehensible disparity of resources. What German generals like Paulus faced was not just Soviet bravery, but the materialization of an industrial colossus that, though less visible than the American one, operated on a gigantic scale. The storm of steel that devastated German positions on the Eastern Front was irrefutable proof of an ammunition production capacity that surpassed by orders of magnitude everything Germany could muster. Internal Wehrmacht documents, such as the reports of General Oberst Heinz Guderian on the scarcity of armored vehicles and spare parts, and the desperate pleas for fuel, painted a picture of logistical bankruptcy. While American hospitals in Tunisia received penicillin in industrial volumes, German field hospitals in Russia battled infections with rationed sulfonamides and often without any resources. The mortality rate from wounds and diseases on the Eastern Front for German forces was dramatically higher than that of Allied forces in the West. Not due to a lack of medical skill, but due to the absence of the pharmaceutical and logistical mathematics of abundance. The Reich's ideological blindness, which prioritized the quality of Wunderwaffen over mass production, was brutally exposed. In 1943, Soviet production of T-34 tanks and artillery pieces exceeded German production in proportions that defied comprehension. German intelligence reports, initially skeptical, began to register the Soviet capacity to replace losses in weeks, while a single loss of a Tiger or Panther was almost irretrievable. Soviet logistics, though less sophisticated than the American, was sustained by massive domestic production and, crucially, by the flow of American Lend-Lease supplies, which provided essential trucks, locomotives, and raw materials. The silent despair was not just the lack of penicillin. The Blitzkrieg Doctrine, based on speed and initial qualitative superiority, could not sustain a war of attrition against an enemy producing millions of artillery shells and tens of thousands of vehicles annually. A 1944 report by General Feldmarschall Erich von Manstein lamented the enemy's almost limitless capacity to absorb losses and continue the offensive, an observation that, in retrospect, included the recovery of their wounded and the replacement of their war materiel on a colossal scale. The irony was profound. The nation that had pioneered chemistry and precision engineering could no longer supply the basic elements for its own soldiers' survival. The storm of steel of Soviet artillery, fueled by industrial production that the American industrial colossus helped sustain, was not merely a tactical challenge. It was the physical manifestation of a mathematical defeat, where the capacity to manufacture and transport surpassed any individual bravery or tactical genius. The Autumn 1944, the Battle of Hurtgen Forest unfolded like a green hell, a meat grinder where the dense vegetation, rugged terrain, and relentless climate transformed every advance into a brutal sacrifice. For the Wehrmacht, entrenched in fortified defensive positions, combat was a test of endurance, a tactical battle that they believed would exhaust the American offensive. However, beneath the surface of the artillery's storm of steel and close-quarters combat, another invisible battlefront afflicted the German ranks: the war against infection. Reports from Oberkommando West, OB West, in November 1944 often underestimated the recovery capability of American units, attributing their persistence to an inexhaustible reserve of men. What German doctrine, focused on tactical superiority and terrain defense, failed to comprehend was the logistical and pharmaceutical dimension of Allied resilience. The conditions in Hurtgen, damp cold, mud, open wounds from shrapnel and bullets, and the scarce sulfanilamide was rationed with the precision of golden ammunition, and penicillin, for most Wehrmacht doctors, remained a distant rumor, a medical Wunderwaffe that the Reich never managed to materialize at scale. In brutal contrast, the American industrial colossus, which fueled the storm of steel with immense volumes of artillery shells, also produced penicillin with a mathematics of abundance incomprehensible to the enemy. Although evacuation conditions in Hurtgen were challenging for both sides, the American medical supply chain ensured that once a wounded soldier reached an aid station or field hospital, they would have immediate and unrestricted access to the miracle drug. Penicillin was administered prophylactically, preventing infections before they established themselves, and treating existing ones with an efficacy that transformed previously fatal injuries into recoverable convalescences. Statistics from the time, compiled by American field surgeons and later ANA. Furthermore, the return-to-duty (RTD) rate for American soldiers wounded in Hurtgen who received penicillin was significantly higher. An American soldier with an open fracture or an abdominal wound, which for the Wehrmacht would represent a permanent or fatal casualty, had a substantial chance of being treated, recovered, and eventually returning to combat or support roles. The blindness of German doctrine lay in its inability to integrate pharmaceutical logistics as a strategic component of attrition warfare. They saw the battlefield as a stage for individual bravery and tactical superiority, but not as a system where the capacity to heal was as decisive as the capacity to wound. The irony was overwhelming. While American artillerymen poured millions of shells, creating a storm of steel that generated thousands of wounded, the same industrial colossus that manufactured these projectiles also produced the means to heal its own men wounded by that same storm. General Feldmarschall Walter Model, commander of Grupo de Ejércitos B, although acknowledging the enemy's tenacity in Hurtgen, never recorded in his diaries or reports the dimension of American medical capacity as a force multiplier. He lamented German losses and the difficulty of replacing troops, but the connection between Allied pharmaceutical abundance and the persistence of their offensives remained a disconcerting paradox. The mathematical defeat was not only manifested in the scarcity of tanks or fuel, but in the inability to preserve the most valuable of resources, the lives of their soldiers. The Battle of Hurtgen Forest, with its brutal price of infection, was further proof that modern warfare was won not only on the battlefield, but in the factories and laboratories that sustained the industrial colossus, where the lives of soldiers had the same industrial priority as the production of projectiles. The first mention of the miracle drug in OKW reports in mid-1942 was met while doctors of the Reich rationed sulfonylamides, facing gangrene and septicemia in wounds. The idea of an abundant antibiotic sounded like Allied propaganda, a fairy tale to demoralize. But what seemed like an isolated medical anomaly was in reality the whisper of a gigantic industrial truth, the manifestation of a colossus operating on a scale that defied German strategic reality. The first concrete indications emerged from interrogations of British and American prisoners of war captured in North Africa in late 1942. Wounded soldiers, who should have been in critical condition, showed recovery rates and absence of secondary infections that puzzled German doctors. The mention of penicillin was recurrent, but German intelligence, rooted in the belief of the Reich's scientific and industrial superiority, especially in chemistry. I.G. Farben dismissed mass production by the Allies. German doctrine, focused on punctual technological innovation, could not conceive that a mold cool. For analysts of the Abwehr and OKW, penicillin was, at most, an experimental drug for restricted use, perhaps reserved for high-ranking officers or exceptional cases. The idea that an entire army could be treated liberally was incompatible with the mentality of scarcity and rationing that permeated the German war economy. The blindness was not of information, but of comprehension. The reports, though fragmented, pointed to a reality that German ideology and military doctrine could not assimilate. The storm of steel that the Wehrmacht understood was one of projectiles and armored vehicles, of mass destruction, not one of a storm of life that preserved enemy manpower. However, in 1943 to 1944, the evidence accumulated, making denial unsustainable. Reports from German field doctors, from Tunisia, the Italian front, and Normandy began to converge. The mortality rate from battle wound infections among the Allies was consistently lower than that of German forces. Allied prisoners of war, German intelligence, though reluctant, began to compile data on Allied penicillin production. Initial estimates, based on incomplete information and an underestimation of American industrial capacity, were low. However, the persistence of Allied mathematics of abundance forced a reevaluation. By mid-1944, with Normandy, the immense American penicillin production capacity, exceeding 6 trillion units annually, began to be understood, belatedly. The irony was brutal. The nation that poured millions of tons of ammunition, feeding the storm of steel that tore through the Reich's defenses, also produced the antidote for its men's wounds on a colossal scale. The revelation was a devastating blow, not only to morale but to German strategic doctrine. The Wehrmacht had been trained for a war of attrition where the enemy, once wounded, would be a permanent casualty. the Allied ability to recycle their wounded to reintroduce soldiers in weeks or months represented a force multiplier that the American industrial colossus not only produced more tanks, planes, and ammunition, it produced more life for its combatants, transforming medical logistics into a strategic weapon as potent as artillery itself. Internal OKW documents from 1944 and 1945, though without a full analysis of the pharmaceutical war, lamented the enemy's incomprehensible ability to replenish their losses and the incessant pressure from their formations, without identifying penicillin as the primary factor. The denial persisted, for admitting Allied superiority in the production of such a fundamental medicine meant admitting a mathematical and industrial defeat on an existential level, undermining the belief in the Reich's superiority. Penicillin, the silent hero, proved that modern war was won not only on the battlefield, but in the factories and laboratories of the industrial colossus, where soldiers' lives had the same industrial priority as projectile production. German intelligence failed to Friedrich Bauer witnessed the silent collapse of a conviction, not in the ruins of Stalingrad, but in the eyes of his own compatriots, prisoners of war in North Africa. What for him was a distressing pharmaceutical paradox, for these men was an existential affront, a brutal subversion of everything they had been taught about scarcity and the Reich's superiority. The reality of Allied abundance, evident in every dose of penicillin and every hearty meal, was material proof of a mathematical defeat that extended far beyond the battlefield, revealing the blindness of an industrial doctrine. May 1943, in American prisoner of war camps in Tunisia and later in the United States, the experience of German soldiers was a cultural and ideological shock of seismic proportions. Accustomed to strict rationing, scarcity of medical supplies, and the doctrine that individual sacrifice was the backbone of the Wehrmacht, they were confronted with a reality of unimaginable logistical opulence. Dr. Bauer, observing his patients, noted not only the accelerated physical recovery due to penicillin, but a gradual disintegration of faith in the system that had sent them to war. The prisoners' accounts, compiled in Allied interrogations and later in recovered war diaries, are unanimous. A sergeant of the 10th Panzer Division, captured after the Battle of Paso-Cazarin, described in his testimony the humiliation of receiving penicillin treatment for a simple skin infection, while his comrades on the Eastern Front succumbed to gangrene due to lack of sulfanilamide. The irony was overwhelming. The same nation that rained a storm of steel of artillery on their positions, generating thousands of wounded, also produced the antidote for these injuries on a colossal scale. The mathematics of abundance was not limited to penicillin. The diet provided to the prisoners of war held by the Americans with daily rations that exceeded in calories and variety what a German civilian or even a FAC. The German prisoner of war, accustomed to precarious subsistence logistics, saw food being discarded as leftovers, something unthinkable in the Reich. This superiority in the production and distribution of food, clothing, and even personal hygiene items was a silent testament to the American industrial colossus, irrefutable proof that war was not just about tactics or bravery, but about the immense capacity to produce and sustain. The ideological blindness of the Reich, which promised victory based on qualitative superiority and German ingenuity, was dismantled by empirical evidence. General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel, in a private conversation in 1944, lamented the enemy's almost unlimited capacity to replace their losses, both in material and men, without, however, understanding the extent of medical and supply logistics as a force multiplier. For the prisoners, the truth was more direct. Germany could not compete with this scale of production. Penicillin, the treatment for an opium. Many prisoners, upon being repatriated after the war, became involuntary missionaries of the truth about Allied industrial superiority, eroding the official post-war German narrative of betrayal or tactical failure. They had seen with their own eyes that the war had been lost not for lack of courage, but due to a disparity of resources and an immense production capacity that Germany could never match. The paradox of penicillin, a life-saving drug, but one that, for the Germans, was a symbol of defeat, encapsulated the essence of total industrial warfare. Logistics, mass production, and the ability to sustain an army with unimaginable abundance, even in captivity, were the silent weapons that sealed the fate of the Third Reich, proving that soldiers' lives held the same industrial priority as projectile production. After 1945, prisoners, involuntary missionaries of American abundance, eroded the Reich's doctrine of superiority. Ubiquitous penicillin and meal leftovers expose. The mass production of penicillin, forged in war, redefined public and military health. The logistics of healing, superior in scale and effectiveness, became a strategic pillar. The industrial colossus that generated the storm of steel also forged a new health doctrine, exposing German blindness to the mathematical defeat of production. The German High Command's initial denial of industrial defeat was a defense. Years after the surrender, Speer's memoirs and Guderian's diaries revealed a belated yet searing recognition of American logistical superiority and production scale. The industrial colossus forged not only the storm of steel, but the mathematical defeat that the Reich's ideological blindness never grasped. After the storm of steel, the production capacity of the American industrial colossus, which forged the Reich's mathematical defeat, transmuted into soft power. The logistics of distributing penicillin and essential goods projected benevolence. Former adversaries on. In 1945, American production of 6.8 trillion units annually against mere thousands of German units sealed the defeat. Allied infection mortality below 4.5% against over 10% for the Axis, revealing the Reich's blindness. For Bauer, penicillin was the epitome of a brutal truth. The war, he realized, had not been won solely by the storm of steel, but by the immense capacity of an industrial colossus to sustain every front. Logistics, an invisible force, was the true strategy, and the production-to-battlefield connection triumphed over individual platforms, an undeniable mathematical defeat for German blindness.